following pre-recorded program is sponsored by Adams Financial Concepts. Welcome to About Money, a different approach to investing you won't hear anywhere else. Your host, Mike Adams, is a registered investment advisor and works with investment portfolios exceeding over $100,000 in net worth and has a proven track record of managing long-term investments, surpassing the markets in the long term. The information shared in the following program is for educational purposes only, and any investment advice given may not be suitable for all investors. And now, here's Mike.
So it is Saturday, and we are talking about money. Who would have thought? Who would have thought at the beginning of this year we would be where we are today, in the middle of a pandemic? Crazy times. Crazy, crazy, crazy. And who would have thought the stock market would have been doing what it's doing? Well, here we are. And where we find ourselves is that the world is racing to develop a vaccine. One or two or more vaccines. There are right now 201 programs to develop a vaccine. And I was fascinated to see that Russia has announced they will begin inoculations of a vaccine in October. They have already announced they're going to begin to vaccinate Russian people in October. So how can they say that? Well, I know a little bit about Russia and how it works. And so I really want to share some of my experiences and give you some insights into what's going on in that country and also how it compares to vaccines in America and vaccine development. So Russia is a top-down country, and they are approaching this in a very different way. The United States has set the standard for how you develop drugs and vaccines. So my first experience with the Soviet Union goes all the way back to 1972. At the time, I was working for Intaco Aluminum up in Ferndale. It was half French-owned, half U.S.-owned. And one of the groomsmen in my wedding was actually a Frenchman who had been working for the French company and one of the key trainers and key managers who I worked with, and he was in my wedding. And I'll explain how all this comes together. So my wife and I were transferred to Saint-Jean-de-Maurienne. We spent a year and a half in this small town, 10,000 people, but it had been one of the development areas for the French aluminum industry. And during that time, my friend, who had been in my wedding, had transferred to Romania. He had been sent to Romania to be supervising their plant because they were having some issues. So 1972, Romania, it was behind the Iron Curtain. It was part of the USSR, the Soviet Union. And so my wife and I made that trip to Romania to visit my friend. Now, to understand this story, you have to understand a little bit about aluminum smelters. There are a long set of furnaces in a row, and the furnaces are they're not like the blast furnaces where you see steel being made. They're like kind of a bathtub. They're long. They might be 13 feet wide, 25 foot long. And on the bottom, you're passing a current actually through the furnace to create the aluminum. You're taking alumina, which is aluminum oxide. You're breaking it apart into the molecules of aluminum and the atoms of aluminum, the atoms of oxygen. The oxygen combines with carbon to make carbon dioxide and carbon monoxide. The aluminum settles into the furnace and forms a metal. So if you look at it, cut away the side, you see on the bottom there's a carbon cathode, and above that you have a metal, maybe 6 or 8 inches of liquid aluminum, and above that you have 6 or 8 inches of, and maybe it's maybe the aluminum is in most furnaces is closer to 12 or 14 inches. And above that, you have a cryolite bath of another 12 or 14 inches. And stuck into that cryolite bath, you have carbon anodes, and you pass a current, a direct current, a very high amperage current. In our case, it was 130,000 amps at 4 volts between the cathode and the anode. And it's very temperature sensitive. You're making aluminum at 1,577 degrees plus or minus 2 degrees. Very temperature sensitive. If it gets too cold, you melt. The cryolite becomes solidified and begins to isolate the furnace so the current doesn't pass. If it becomes too hot, you begin to burn up the anodes and you melt the cryolite, and you go through the side of the furnace and spill aluminum out. So temperature control is really important. So I met the plant manager at the smelter in Romania where my friend was working. And he told me the story because he had been in charge of the furnaces. And during the transition, or during the time he was there, the furnaces began to overheat. And the way you control heat is you increase the amount of aluminum because the aluminum becomes a heat sink. Or you reduce the voltage going through the furnace. But his furnaces were overheating. He went ahead and raised the aluminum. Now he did that too little, too late, and so the furnaces continued to overheat. Now by each furnace, there's a blackboard, and you mark down everything that you do to the furnace. When you increase the metal in the furnace, the amount of metal in the furnace, you write that down. When you change the voltage, you write that down. So as the furnaces overheated, the works manager, who was one of the top people in the Communist Party, the works manager over the facility decided it was sabotage. And he sent through investigators who wore white shirts and ties in the dirty smelter, and they took down all the information on the blackboard. So the plant manager, the guy who was to become plant manager, who was in charge of the superintendent of the furnaces, the pot lines, is sitting at home one night in his apartment with his wife, and there's a knock at the door, and it's the police. And they say, "Come with us." They don't say anything to his wife. They don't say anything to him. They take him down to the local prison. They take his clothes. They lock him up in prison. They never tell him why he's being sent to prison. They never say anything to his wife where he went. 2 years later, they came out. They call him out of prison. They give him back his clothes. They put him in a car. They drive him back to his apartment. They let him out, and he returns with his wife. For 2 years, he's in prison. During that time, no one tells him why. No one tells his wife where he went. But during that 2 years, he's in prison. The message is very clear. He made a decision, and when you make a decision, the result is, or can be, prison. But it can be even worse. 20 years later, I had a Rotary exchange, and there was a Russian person that came to stay with us. And it's a long story how it all evolved. But I formed a company through meeting him and meeting some other people, formed a company to convert a former Soviet military plant to commercial aviation in the country of Georgia. Georgia had been part of the Soviet Union, not our state of Georgia, but the country of Georgia. And it was now an independent country. And I know it's a complicated story, and there's a lot of pieces. But at a Georgian dinner, when you have a company dinner, when you have a big family dinner, there's a lot of plates on the table, and you take a little of this and a little of that. But there's also something that happens is that you have a tamada. The tamada is the toastmaster. And during the meal, men will get up, or the diners will get up and begin to make toast. And those toasts might begin with one person, and another person carry it on, and another person carry it on. So a toast might last for 45 minutes to an hour. And during that time, I learned the story about the director of that Soviet aircraft plant. During the toast, so it said he was in charge of the plant when they decided to install NCH machines, computer automation machines. But no, none of the plants in the Soviet Union could make them work. He offered a $15 a month bonus if the workers would make it work, and they did. Had it not worked, he would have been executed for making that decision. So the point of this is that decisions are made from the top down, and people do not want to make a decision, or did not want to make a decision in the Soviet Union. The entire baby boomer generation was like that, dealing with people in that facility, dealing with people in other businesses. They did not want to make a decision. It was difficult to make decisions. It wasn't happening with the youngest people, but it was happening with the older people. Now, there's a point to this story, and I'll get to it after the commercial, so don't go away. We're coming to commercial time. There's a point to all this when I come back to talking about vaccines and what's happening in Russia and what the difference is between their focus and what we do. So don't go away. Lots to this story, lots beyond that. I'll be right back.
About Money with Mike Adams on AM 1590, The Answer. For more information, click on Adams Financial Concepts. About Money continues. Remember the website, adamsfinancialconcepts.com. Here's Mike.
So I've been talking. The Russian President Putin announced they are going to have a vaccine. They're going to begin to inoculate people in October. It's a top-down strategy setting it up. They don't have the vaccine yet. They don't even know if it works, but they're going to begin to inoculate people in October. So I started to share my experience. So I shared the experience of being in Romania, but I also got involved in converting a former military plant to commercial aviation in the country of Georgia. Now, I got to learn a lot about aviation. And when you consider the Russian planes, they're an example of how this happened. The Tupolev 134 was the most sold aircraft of all jets. From a distance, it looks like the Boeing 727. Remember that plane? It had the two engines on the back. The Tupolev 34 was the same way, but there were differences. In the United States, you alloy aluminum or steel to give the metal different properties. With a top-down structure, they made aluminum. It was all the same alloy. So the design had to take into consideration, if it didn't have quite the properties you wanted it to have, you had to add metal. If it didn't have enough strength, you had to add a lot of metal to it. So to get the same strength, they added extra aluminum. Now, if you look at the difference between the two planes, the 727 and the Tu-34, the 727 had the wheel carriage that came under the fuselage, under the tube, where all the passengers are. That's where the wheel carriage sat. And so that carried, when the plane came down, it came down and it carried the plane. But with the Tu-134, the wheels were under the wings. But what that meant is that the wings had to be much stronger because they had to carry that weight. It was like a fulcrum or a seesaw. The further out on the seesaw you are, the more momentum you have in any direction. So when you're coming down and landing, you have to take a much stronger set of wings to bring that down. That meant more metal. That meant more things. So the wings on the Tu-134 were much stronger than on the 727. That meant more weight. More weight, more weight, more weight everywhere. And that meant more fuel. Now, for Russia, that wasn't a big deal because they produced a lot of oil, and so they had the fuel to do. As long as they had no competition, they could sell the Tu-134s. So I was invited at one time and went to a tech conference where there were 300 of us invited. It was like the Commerce Secretary of the U.S. inviting us to a conference. Economics Minister was there. And he said the only difference between Russian products and U.S. products is marketing. I can tell you that's not true. By the way, the tires on the Tu-134 were only semi-inflated because a lot of airports were not paved. The tires had to be semi-inflated so the planes could land on non-paved airports. Think about all that. Ran into a shoe manufacturer. The shoe manufacturers had quotas to meet, and if they didn't meet a quota when they loaded a truck, they would load the rest of the truck with bricks. TVs were being made, and they didn't have all the components, so they just put the back of the TV on and shipped them out. Didn't work, but that's okay. They shipped the TVs. We went and we talked to companies making fuel cells. Western Washington was building a car using fuel cells. That's taking hydrogen, breaking it into, or combining it with oxygen to make water, and you release energy when you do that. The Russians had fuel cells, and they demonstrated how it would work. So we brought the technology back to the U.S., and it worked, but the efficiency was nothing close to what they claimed. Not a big surprise, because each and every technology we looked at had been ordered by higher-ups to be made, but the data was always falsified. Every single technology we looked at. If it had been one or two, you could have said maybe it's dishonest sciences, so they had things wrong. But every single one, more than half a dozen, the data could not be reproduced. It was a top-down economy, which brings me back to Putin and the recreation of the Soviet business model, because he's built a top-down economy. He felt that the Soviet Union and the breakup of the Soviet Union was the biggest disaster of the 20th century. He wants to rebuild it, and he wants to rebuild the type of economy they had. So it's no surprise that Putin has given an order that he wants a vaccine, he wants it ready by October, and he wants to start inoculating people within that time frame. Doesn't say anything about testing, making sure that it works. He just wants a vaccine, and he expects to have it. He expects the scientists to produce it, the biologists to produce it, and he wants to start injecting people. That's what he wants. Set the time frame. So contrast that to what takes place for an FDA approval. Because of the pandemic, a number of shortcuts have been taken, time frames have been shortened, but the process is very similar. Normally with an approval of a vaccine or a drug, it begins with an animal study. You take, for example, the bad virus, the coronavirus, you inject it into animals, or the other virus or the other disease drug. You inject it into an animal, you inject the vaccine, and see if the vaccine works. And you do it vice versa. You inject the animal with the vaccine and then the bad virus and see if it prevents the virus from taking place. If the animal study works, and because it's in an animal, you never know that it's going to work the same in humans, you begin what's called a phase 1 trial. And that's a safety trial. It's a very small number of people. You're looking for side effects. You're making sure that whatever you inject doesn't kill the person, doesn't have such great side effects that it means that you don't want to pursue any further. If you have a good safety profile, you move to a phase 2, and this is a larger trial, a larger number of people, and now you want to figure out the dose. Are you going to give 50 milligrams, 100 milligrams, 200 milligrams? How much are you going to give as a dose? And you look at how people react at different doses. Once you find the optimum dose, then you begin a phase 3 trial, and that can be a very big trial. In the case of the vaccine, they're talking about 30,000 people to be injected. It's very large. And from the beginning, you begin with a trial design and you begin with endpoints. This is what we want to achieve. This is the primary thing we want to achieve. And if that's not achieved, we want to see a secondary thing. And of the 30,000 people, you're going to give 15,000 a placebo and 15,000 the actual vaccine. You're going to try between the two. No one knows if they're giving the placebo or if they're giving the vaccine. And with that number of people, you're trying to build a statistically significant model, but you're also controlling the side effects. In each one of these phases, you're looking at the side effects. Once that trial is done, that is normally sent to an independent panel. Whether that's going to happen with a vaccine or not, I don't know. There's been some talk about skipping that part. But you send it to an independent panel who should be completely independent. They have no skin in the game. They just want to review it, and they are experts in that area. And they look at it to see if it really works. They'll look at the side effects. They'll look at the total data. They'll look at everything coming in. And then they can recommend that it goes to the full FDA for approval. That's how it normally works. Then the full FDA will look at it. Now, in the case of the vaccine, some of that's been shortened because usually with a trial, you're looking at a vaccine and you want to see it over a good length of time to see that it actually works. In the case of the pandemic, COVID-19, the time frame has been significantly shortened. The animal studies were very brief. The phase 1, the phase 2 have been fairly brief. And the phase 2 are continuing to take place, even though the phase 3, in some vaccines, have already started. It started as of July 27th in one case, before that in another case. And the idea is to vaccinate the people and see if there's a difference between the 15,000 who get the placebo and the 15,000 who get the vaccine. The primary endpoint for the trials is to see that they become immune to COVID-19. The idea is to prevent symptomatic COVID-19. A secondary endpoint, even if they don't achieve that, is if they can prevent hospitalization and infection. And there's some concern. The Oxford vaccine showed that some got COVID-19, but it wasn't severe, but they were able to continue to spread the disease. So there's a concern about the length of trial. How many participants will be exposed, what the exposure will be, and even if they're exposed, will they be able to continue to spread the disease? Unlike Russia, if politics don't interfere, the test will be driven by the data. With Russia, it's a top-down, it's political. We want a vaccine. We're going to have a vaccine by October, and we're going to start giving it to people. We don't know how long it will take to get 30,000 people vaccinated and to see the results. Hopefully, by the end of the year. But it's going to take some time, and it should be data-driven if it all works. That's where we are with the vaccine. That's where we are. I think there's a significant probability we will have a vaccine, or 2 or 3. I'm not sure how confident we will be in the final results with the speed at which this is being done. That all will come out later in the year. Stay with me. We got more to come.
About Money with Mike Adams on AM 1590, The Answer. For more information, click on Adams Financial Concepts. About Money with Mike Adams on AM 1590, The Answer. For more information, click on adamsfinancialconcepts.com.
So I was talking about a vaccine, but I want to shift gears now. I want to talk about the 20th century, last century. When you think about the last century, we had a Great Depression. We had numerous recessions, the 1960s, the 1980s, the 1940s, the 1900s, and all that time in between. We went through 2 world wars. We went through a pandemic. We went through the Spanish flu pandemic that killed 50 million people worldwide. And a good portion of those were people within the United States. We went through the period of communism and the Cold War. We saw 2 presidents assassinated in the United States. We saw world upsets like Chernobyl, like 3 Mile Island. We saw multiple times when businesses failed, major businesses who failed because they cooked their books or they did something that was illegal. We saw a multitude of problems and issues. We saw the junk bond debacle. We saw the savings and loan debacle. We saw huge inflation periods of time. But with all those negatives, think of all the negatives we saw. The Dow began on January 1st, 1900, at a value of 66. Think about that. January 1st, 1900, the Dow stood at 66. On December 31st, 1999, the Dow stood at 11,467. With all those negatives, the Dow went from 66 to 11,467. Again, 66 to 11,467. Even every time I talk about the numbers, I have to repeat it again and again to get it into my mind how much the increase has been in the stock market. And why did that happen? Because it wasn't the negatives, it was the positives. We had such a change in demographics, we had a change in lifestyles, we had a change in technology. Go back. The beginning of the 20th century, we didn't have telephone, we didn't have radio, we didn't have cars, we didn't have airplanes, we didn't have computers, we didn't have very much electrical generation. We were just beginning the electrical revolution. A lot of parts didn't have clean water. We didn't have medicines. We didn't have all the things we do today. So all that happened as the Dow went from 66 to 11,467, which brings me back to something which I talk about every 3 to 6 to 9 months. The Standard Chartered Bank study came out in 2011. I've been talking about it ever since because I think it gives a framework of what we're seeing today. So I want to revisit that because there may be some things to learn with the pandemic. So as you look at what that study was, Standard Chartered Bank, 1,700 branches, 80,000 employees, they're out of the UK. They looked at periods of time of worldwide growth. And they said they were super growth cycles, that in the beginning followed a pattern. The first cycle was, and they were a long-term cycle, the first cycle was from 1870 to 1930, 1913, a period of 43 years. And it was driven primarily by the industrialization of the United States. If you look at where the United States was at the beginning of that cycle, almost half the people in the U.S. worked on farms or farm-related. In 1874, there was a financial crisis. There was no bailout, no stimulus. And we went almost 30 years, every other year, like 2008. It was a very big pain. For agriculture, it meant that many farmers went down. Many of the big plantations went down. But it was a time of powerful growth, and it was a time of industrialization. It was difficult. There were business cycles that were very dramatic, but the United States emerged as a world leader. And that became a big change because London had been the world's financial capital. By the end of that first super cycle, the United States had emerged as the world capital of finance. So I want to take you back. to what was happening at the beginning of the 20th century in 1900. You had one horse for every 10 to 20 residents in each city. And each of those horses produced 30 to 50 pounds of manure, 2 quarts of urine every day. Think about that. You know, the pictures on TV, you see the streets were clean, everything was nice. That wasn't the way it was. The largest cities like New York City had hundreds of thousands of horses. They had manure piles that were 40 to 50 to 60 feet high. They had thousands of dead horses and goats and pigs and cattle embedded in uncollected filth for days and weeks. Horses died. They were left in the streets, dogs and cats and rats. Sometimes you had manure that was 2 to 3 feet deep. You had people, usually men, who actually earned a living by being hired to shovel a path from one side of the street to the other side of the street through the manure. They would shovel a pathway. You had diphtheria, whooping cough, typhoid, typhus, fevers, and diseases. Hard to think about today, hard to fathom. When you watch TV, the streets were always clean. It wasn't that way. But you know, with all that, along came the automobile. The horse dependence went away, and along with that, all the manure, urine, and complications. That happened during that first business cycle. But it wasn't just a change there, because think about what life was like during that time worldwide. We were emerging from poverty, $3.10 in today's dollars. In 1820, leading up to that period of time, 94% of the world's population, including the U.S., was living on $3.10 a day. Not in their dollars, but in today's dollars. That was pennies at their time. $3.10 a day. In 1820, that's $19 a month, $228 a year. That was poverty in the U.S., 94% of the world. We lived on farms, and the life expectancy was 37 years. By 1870, things had begun to get better. At the beginning of the supercycle, only 87% of the world was living in poverty. Half the population still lived on farms, and most towns were under 2,500 people. U.S. labor rates had risen from $19 a month to $292 a month in today's dollars. Life. Shoes in 1870 fit either foot. They were handmade. Dinner tended to be chicken stew and dumplings, mashed potatoes and biscuits, honey. No salads. Life expectancy was 44 years. We lived in a time of smallpox, cholera, tuberculosis, and yellow fever. A medical kit. What did a medical kit exist? It was usually a black bag. You see the doctors on TV or in movies carrying a black bag. You know what was in the black bag? Mostly saws and knives for amputation. That's how people lived. By 1915, at the end of that first supercycle, in the U.S. or in the rest of the world, 82% of the people lived in poverty, down from 87% in 1870. By 1950, 82%. But 4 out of 5 in the U.S. had moved into the cities. Only 1 out of 5, 20% of the population was on farms. And U.S. labor rates had risen from $292 at the beginning of that cycle to $1,341 a month in today's dollars. $8 an hour was the average of work labor. Today, there are states that have a lower minimum wage than the average person lived in 1915. By 1915, shoes were being actually factory made. There was a right foot and a left foot. Hand labor had disappeared, had been replaced by factories. Food was much more varied, and life expectancy had grown to 53 years. Think about it. 1820, 37, by 1915 to 53. And the U.S. had moved from a poverty time to the beginning of world middle class. The world still 82% lived in poverty. They lived as subsistence, not as consumer. 82% of the world lived on $3.10 a day. That's what it was during the first supercycle. The second supercycle began in 1945 and lasted for 35 years through 1970. It was driven by Europe's reconstruction and by Asian exports. It was a relatively benign business cycle, growth in wealth countries like the US and UK and France and Germany, and the Dow went from 150 to 1,000. It was the death of the colonial system in Africa and Asia. And it was the Cold War. It was during that period of time that things began to change in developing countries and poverty began to exist in those times. We'll come back and talk about the supercycle in the third supercycle in which we're now living and the effect of the pandemic. Don't go away. More to cover.
About Money with Mike Adams on AM 1590, The Answer. For more information, click on Adams Financial Concepts. About Money continues. Remember the website, adamsfinancialconcepts.com. Here's Mike.
So I've been talking and revisiting this idea of the supercycle. It's something that I've talked about over the years since 2011. We're now into almost the 10th year that I've been talking about it. The new supercycle began in 2009, according to Standard Chartered Bank. I believe that that's really true, and that's really a framework in which we can look at it from the mile-high view. Began in 2009, expected to last beyond 2030. And it's going to be driven by the emerging nations, and especially by Asia. The winners are going to be global winners: China, India, Brazil, Indonesia, Russia, Turkey, Sub-Saharan Africa. There's going to be big risk during this supercycle, and we're seeing some of that develop. We're now 10 years into this, and we're seeing some of the political and social volatility. The things like the Asian storm or the Arab storm, that happened during this period of time when you have an educated population and not jobs, and you have a lot of corruption in the country. Countries, however, will be less transparent. They'll be less stable, and investments in those countries are going to be more vulnerable, subject to politicians and bureaucrats. Corruption could be epidemic during this time. There's going to be this fundamental shift in power. If you look at the U.S. in 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, the United States had 50% of the world's GDP. Today, we're down to 25% because we're seeing other countries grow. I do series on China, and the amount of growth in their GDP has been phenomenal during that period of time. Now, they're also a top-down country, just like I described with Putin and the vaccine, and I expect we'll see some of the same issues we saw in Russia, but that's a whole different program. But we're seeing that there is, during these times of supercycles, every supercycle has its shares of losers. Everyone has a group of winners. From the first supercycle, agriculture was the big loser in the first supercycle in the U.S. So it's not just industries, it's companies as well. But what we're seeing, and why the estimate is that it will be the emerging countries that win, is because those countries are emerging from poverty. The big decline began in 1860, partly the end of the second supercycle. But today, as we're going through this, before the beginning of this year, it was about 20% of the world's population that was in poverty, living on $3.10 a day or less. That's still a very large number. But when you think about where it came from 1945 to today. It's a very significant change. 1945, 73% of the world was in poverty. By 1960, it was beginning to decline, and it's declined very rapidly to today. And think of the impact of what's happening. I had a client once who was the plant manager for American Standard in Tianjin, China. And this goes back to the 1990s. And they had 1,000 employees, actually, the beginning of the 90s. They had 1,000 employees at that factory. They were making ceramic toilets, ceramic bathtubs, ceramic shower stalls. Not one of those 1,000 employees had ever seen a ceramic toilet, a ceramic bathtub, or a ceramic shower. Today, those employees drive cars, they buy lattes, they have smartphones. They've emerged from a subsistence living where they raised their own food, where they made their own clothes, where they bartered for a number of things. They raised a lot of their own meat. They moved from that subsistence to go to the grocery store for food now. They made factory-made clothes. The smartphones, their life has changed. They moved from subsistence and poverty into the middle class, and that is what the definition of middle class is you become a consumer instead of subsistence. That's happening. It's happened in China. It's happening in the rest of the world. And that opens up opportunities. There's talk about jobs moving from the United States to foreign countries, but a lot of those jobs that are being created in foreign countries would never come back to the U.S. Starbucks, for example, has stores all over China and in different countries. Those are jobs that weren't exported from the U.S. They're jobs that were created because they have the stores there. If you look at the Standard & Poor's 500, those companies derive half of their revenues from overseas. We're international. And yes, there's a lot of things going on with globalization and with food chains, with the supply chains. Those things are going to change. They're going to dramatically change. That is something that's going on. But nevertheless, companies are international. By 2030, Brookings Institute some years ago estimated that 93% of the world's middle class would be in those emerging countries. 93%. If you look at China, 30 years ago, 260 million lived below the poverty line. Today, less than 30 million. That's still a huge number, but it's declining. And yes, the pandemic may very well set back the timeline, but that after all is not necessarily bad. That means we have a longer time to prepare for the next secular bear market. And I've talked about how this secular bull market that we're living in, this super cycle time, will end with a high bout of inflation. I still believe that's going to be true. It's not going to end with the pandemic. We will be beyond the pandemic. The markets will continue to roll on. Businesses will continue to roll on. It's going to take some time to get there, but we are on our way. The super cycle is real, and it's continuing to roll. We may have some setbacks, and we probably will have some setbacks. The pandemic is going to be a setback. We're thrusting a lot of people back under the poverty line, both in this country and around the world. It's going to take some years to recover that. But during that time, if you're part of my clients, if you're part of the market, it should be a good time for continuing to make funds. And it will be a good time in which to make the investments and give us more time to grow a margin of safety for the next secular bear market. And there will be a secular bull market, almost for sure. You can never say positively, absolutely, but the chances are there will be a secular bull market, you need a large margin of safety to get through that, especially if it's the inflation time between 1961 and 1979. The dollar lost 70% of its value. 70%. It's never regained that. Stock market went down 35% during the Great Recession. It recovered. During the pandemic, it went down. It's probably recovered. The dollar never recovered. We need time to get back. So this gives us the time. This adds to the time we have to continue to build that margin of safety. Use the time well. So that kind of brings an end to this, what I have to talk about on that. If you miss any of these programs, you can find podcasts on YouTube. Dial it, Adams Financial Concepts.
Listening to About Money with Mike Adams, a registered investment advisor. If you'd like more information about what you heard today, or about Mike's investment philosophy and strategy, or if you'd like Mike to evaluate your own portfolio, click on adamsfinancialconcepts.com. That's adamsfinancialconcepts.com. The information shared in the preceding program was for educational purposes only, and any investment advice given may not be suitable for all investors. Join us again next Saturday at noon for more About Money with Mike Adams, here on AM 1590. The Answer. The preceding program was sponsored by Adams Financial Concepts.